Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Charleston Festival. This afternoon, I want to introduce you to the authors of 3 must-read books, all of them about the world of the 1950s. But first, just a little perspective. My grandmother, Vanessa Bell, who lived at Charleston, died in 1961. It's curious to think that she spent her declining years in this house in the 1950s. This crumbly Sussex idyll of flowers and colour, artists and potters, here under the South Downs, occupied the same space as a completely different world, the consumerist, never-had-it-so-good world of Harold Macmillan, the world of the Cold War, of rock and roll, of holiday camps and convenience foods. Vanessa Bell's world barely intersected with the 1950s stereotype, but then she never was a conformist. Today, Rachel Cooke and Ben Watt, with the help of David Kynaston, are going to explore whether that 1950s stereotype holds any truth. Rachel Cooke is an award-winning journalist and critic. Sometimes, when I open my copy of the Observer Review, I think to myself, this entire newspaper is single-handedly written by Rachel Cooke.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, it is true. I think that probably says more about Rachel than it does about the Observer. From political to pop, literary to legal, Rachel's range and grasp is incredibly impressive. Her first book is Her Brilliant Career, which I think is an apt title, an inspiring debunking of the 50s housewife cliché. Ben Watt is probably best known to most of us as one half of the singing-songwriting duo Everything But the Girl, composer of their hit Missing. But Ben has also turned his extremely talented hand to the DJ turntable, to the creation of a string of successful nightclubs, and to masterminding the record label Buzz and Fly. Not content with all this, he has recently turned in a new direction, as writer of a comic, poignant and searching memoir about his parents' 1950s showbiz romance and marriage. With 2 such incredibly vibrant writers, I think social historian David Kynaston may have his work cut out to steer the discussion. However, I expect them to defer to the chairman, since, as I have good reason to know, if anyone is an authority on post-war Britain, it's David, now about to publish Modernity Britain, Book 2, A Shake of the Dice, 1959-1962, the tongue-tripping title of the 4th in his magisterial series on both post-war Britain, Tales of a New Jerusalem. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. 10 minutes max from me, broad overview on what one might call the long 1950s, say the 20 years or so after the war, and then we'll be on to the main course of the event with the particular books and their authors. So some very broad brush thoughts on those 20-odd years after the war, what I, for the sake of argument, am calling the long 1950s, up to, say, 1965, the year of Churchill's death and funeral. That's often seen as a line in the sand. And I find myself falling back on the old historian's cliché, change and continuity, and apologies for the cliché, but it's kind of true. Change. Yes, things were starting to change in the course of these 20 years, particularly, I think, from the mid-1950s. I tend to think of those first 10 years after the war, notwithstanding the tremendous achievements in many ways of the Attlee government. I tend to think of those 10 years after the war, once life had returned to a sort of normality, as in a sense quite frozen. And then from the mid-50s, things really were starting to move. And just half a dozen examples in no particular order. Obviously, the end of rationing, 1954, the coming of consumerism, Which magazine, for example, in 1957, the coming of supermarkets, the coming of choice. By the early 60s, 2 particular childhood memories of mine. I remember the excitement of going to someone's house and, for the first time, flavoured crisps, which some of you will recall were cheese and onion. But the thing actually that really excited me as a 10 or 11-year-old was Philadelphia cream cheese from the States. And I think it was the fact it was made by Kraft, spelt with a K, but it had some deep visceral appeal. Immigration was increasing, of course, from the mid-50s. That particular phase culminating in the restrictions imposed on the new Commonwealth immigration in 1962. So it's the start of a more multiracial, multicultural society. There's something of a pattern emerging with the erosion of traditional working class culture in the context of greater affluence, greater physical, if not always social, mobility. For example, pubs were in a long decline. Cinema was in decline. Football was in decline. If you look at the attendances, the Wakes weeks were in decline. A northern industrial town, for example, would take all the factories would close down at the same time for a week or a fortnight, and all the people in the town would go off to kind of Blackpool or Scarborough or whatever and have their holidays with their next door neighbours. And the historian of Wakes Weeks identifies the late 50s, early 60s as the decline of that. Slum clearance was starting to happen on a large scale, destruction of traditional communities replaced by high-rise and all that. And more generally, the whole sort of modernity zeitgeist that I've been trying to trace in my current books, rapid city centre redevelopment. Take a city like Birmingham, for example, transformed in a matter of years. And also, obviously, there was somewhat less deference in society. And the obvious landmarks, Beyond the Fringe, Private Eye, TW3, by the early 60s. The Theatrical Revolution, of course, going back to Osborne's Look Back in Anger in 56, the new wave of British cinema, greater social realism, and, of course, the coming of modern pop with the Beatles, the Stones, and that classic scene in 1964, I think, in A Hard Day's Night, when an old stuffy gent in the railway carriage shuts the window and, is it Ringo, opens it in a decisive, symbolic moment. So lots of change happening, but I would want to put personally, and it's very subjective and impressionistic, at least as much emphasis on continuity. We were still socially a very conservative, lowercase c society. And you think about homosexuality, abortion, capital punishment, the great trinity, where the reforms were to happen later in the 60s, but it was still unreformed, unreconstructed by the end of the 50s or into the early 60s. Still very hierarchical. Businesses, organisations generally, the City of London, which I spent many years studying, all organised on a very hierarchical and strongly class basis. Often who you knew mattered more than what you knew. The more positive side of that, one could argue, was paternalism, jobs for life, greater job security, fringe benefits, and so on, a company like ICI, for example. We were still a very insular society. You think of the battle of generations between in Steptoe and Son, between the father and Harold, and the father, played by Wilfred Bramble, always thwarting the ambitions of Harold. Harold wanted to broaden his horizons, perhaps even go abroad on holiday, but the father having none of it and usually getting his way. And traditional British seaside holiday, still dominant in the 60s. It was the 70s, really, that saw the decline there. And the continuities in the rhythms of daily life, particularly, I think, out of London. And I've recently read a PhD thesis, a fascinating work about the Black Country, that area, that very distinctive area between Birmingham and Wolverhampton. And the author takes three particular districts of the Black Country, and through a mixture of oral history and also the contemporary written sources, she draws a picture of a very compelling picture of continuity, and she calls her thesis "Old Habits Persist," which is a phrase from Richard Hogarth's The Uses of Literacy. The historian called Rosalind Watkins Singleton, based at Wolverhampton, she argues there were three dominant concepts underpinning everything in terms of day-to-day life in the Black Country: neighbourliness, pride, and respectability. She shows great psychological resistance to owner occupation, seen as a rope around people's necks, resistance to hire purchase, In the family economies, exchange of goods and services still very important. The pawn shop still very important. The co-op absolutely central in daily life. And as far as the youth is concerned, the youth revolution of the 60s, she shows teenagers living at home were seldom free to spend their disposable income. They had to contribute it to the family coffers. And in the round, it's a fascinating portrait of continuity. In a part of the country way distant from the metropolis and from cutting-edge fashions and all the rest of it, but surely I would have thought far more representative than, well, to give an extreme example, Soho or Notting Hill or whatever. Finally, in this broad brush, something about women, because women are going to feature heavily, I think, in this afternoon's session. And for these 20 years, my stress would be more on continuity than on change. Certainly as far as external perceptions of women were concerned. 1962, an ad for Kenwood Chef, quote, "The chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for!" Exclamation mark. Very low glass ceilings, or do I mean very high? Perhaps I mean very high. House of Commons, early 60s, 96% men. BBC, top 150 jobs at the BBC, 146 occupied by men. There was a general assumption, a normative assumption, particularly on the part of women's magazines, and one can't really exaggerate the influence of women's magazines, read by 5 women out of 6, the great mass circulation, Woman's Own, and so on. An assumption that married women, especially middle-class married women, stayed at home. And according to the 1961 census, 65% of married women aged 20 to 64 were not in paid employment. So you only have 35%, so just over a third. So that was the reality, and that was the assumption still at this point. And on marriage, just wanted to say 3 or 4 things to finish with. A, that it was overwhelmingly the norm if one looks at the figures. 2, divorce still largely unthinkable for most people by the end of the 50s, the early 60s. That changes markedly at the end of the 60s with the no-fault divorce legislation that comes in. And it's one of the fascinating parts of Ben's book is to do with divorce in the late 50s, early 60s. The so-called companionate marriage, which sociologists were detecting the rise of, and by companionate, that means husbands and wives sharing activities, consulting before taking decisions and so on. Yes, it was on the rise, but it still seems to have been the exception as far as one can tell from the empirical evidence. And separate spheres, i.e. husbands and wives, essentially living lives apart, usually with the husband as the dominant partner, still the norm. So all that's my emphasis on continuity, but just final thought to finish with on change to do with women. There does seem to have been starting to happen in these post-war years, a kind of emotional revolution, as it were, in which women in particular started to choose their life partners less on pragmatic grounds, and traditionally they had, I think, chosen their life partners, their husbands, on pragmatic grounds. He's a good, solid, reliable earner, above all, but moving away from pragmatic grounds to more emotional grounds. It's a long-term revolution. It's been charted brilliantly by a historian just down the road at Sussex, Claire Langhamer, and it has that. If that emotional revolution, of course, would have huge unfolding consequences. But I think this is the moment to cue in some real-life women, and even perhaps the odd man. So, Rachel, it's all yours.
It's slightly intimidating to be talking about the 1950s in front of David, because he knows a great deal more than I do, and I'm about to rubbish some of the things that he said, even worse. I'm going to tell you, some of you will have read my book, and I'm sorry if I'm going to tell you things that you already know, but I know that many of you won't. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wrote my book, and I'm going to tell you a very brief few details of the 10 women whose stories I tell inside it. I've interviewed lots of writers myself, and they hate being asked, how did you get the idea for your book? But I'm really lucky because I have a moment when I had the idea for my book, which was that I bought a sideboard on eBay. It's an Urkel sideboard, and some of you will remember Urkel. Some of you will be frantically trying to buy it yourselves, in which case, bad luck, because I got the best sideboard in Britain, and I paid £68 for it, and I was completely thrilled with it. And the sideboard started me thinking, because in my kitchen where it stands, it looked so modern. It's made of pale beech and elm. And I couldn't match it up in my mind with the houses of my grandparents. I was very close to my grandparents. They lived in the north in dark terraced houses, and their houses were decorated with antimacassars, crystal vases. They aspired to fitted carpets, all of that, and mainly brown furniture, what we call brown furniture. And in my mind, the 50s split in two. There was this kind of Urkel 50s, which was modern and Swedish and atomic. And there was the 50s of my grandparents, who my grannies had left school when they were 13, and they were housewives. And I made a slightly sexist rhetorical leap at that point. I thought, if I work on the basis that it's women that decide how the house looks, what were the women who bought Urkel furniture trying to say about themselves? And from there, I made another leap, and I thought, I wonder, there must have been women who were having careers in the 50s. There just must. And at the same time, I was getting more and more annoyed because Call the Midwife was on, and the first series of Mad Men, and this housewife thing just kept coming up and up. I'm a journalist, and I'm a contrarian, and I'm a skeptic. So my job is always to argue against received opinions, so that's what I did. And I set out to find some women who'd had exciting, pioneering careers, and also, I hoped, pioneering private lives, because my instinct was that if you were a pioneer in the workplace, you might also have a complicated private life. As I've said, I'm a journalist, so I'm also a gossip, and I wanted to know about those quotidian things. I wanted to know about how people managed their children and their affairs and all of that as well. I wanted the whole picture. But the book is mainly about work. And I wanted to tell the story of the 50s through these 10 women's lives, so they each had to have a different profession. I wanted to talk about food and gardening and the law and architecture and archaeology and all of the 50s. I wanted to use these women as a way of doing that. The question was how to find them, and this was quite hard in the beginning. David put me onto two of them. They were just mentioned in one of his big books, and I made a note, and I went off, found out more about them. To my great surprise, I ended up with more than 10, and I had to have a kind of beauty pageant, and some people were just chucked out. Lucian Day, for instance, the great fabric designer, out. Too boring for my purposes. So, and that was a surprise to me. The other thing was a surprise. I thought that there might be a fair number of, what we would call spinsters. In fact, all of the women in my book had children or relationships where they had children, not necessarily with men. And the ones who didn't have children had definitely made a decision not to have children. So, who are these 10 women? I'll just briefly tell you who they are. There's a cook in my book, Patience Gray. You may think that Elizabeth David was the biggest-selling cookery writer of the 50s. Wrong, she wasn't. Patience Gray was. She wrote a marvellous book called Plat du Jour. It was the first book that told you that it was all right to take your casserole from the kitchen and plonk it on the table. Patience had a remarkable life. Like all of the women in my book, the war had liberated her. She'd been involved in training the Home Guard to make Molotov cocktails. And like all of the women in my book, when the war ended, she was determined, ironically, not to go back into the kitchen. She wanted to have a life. And she got a job as a journalist. She was the first woman's editor of The Observer, where I work. But her main thing was cooking. And she did it marvellously well. She had super complicated private life, which we may talk about a bit later. There's a gardener in my book, Margery Fish. Margery is the oldest of the women in the book. She lived through 2 wars. And she was everybody's favourite maiden aunt. And she worked as a secretary at Northcliffe House. She was the secretary of the editor of the Daily Mail, who was a tyrannical man called Walter Fish. Daily Mail editors never change. Walter was widowed, and as men did in those days, he married the person who was on hand, who was his secretary. When the Second War came along, they couldn't face the bombs, so they went to Somerset and they bought a beautiful manor house there, and they took up gardening. But Walter was a dictator, as I've said, and he wanted a garden which was lawns, paths, dahlias, a Tudor-Beaton garden. But Margery, even though she looked like this rather stout spinster, she was inwardly romantic and yearning. She wanted a wild garden with seed pods and wild flowers and everything to be slightly overgrown. But of course she couldn't win that battle. Walter had his way. He was out there, in his drive-on lawnmower. Then she had a great bit of good luck. Walter died. She observed a decent mourning period, and then she went out, she dug up the garden, and she made the garden she wanted. And she wrote a wonderful book, which has never been out of print, called We Made a Garden, in which she gently satirises Walter, perhaps not so gently. It's a wonderful book, and it was very much admired by Vita Sackville-West, who's someone who has connections to this extraordinary place that we're in. There's an architect in my book, Alison Smithson. She's now best known for a building which is very unpopular, Robin Hood Gardens in the East End. But in the early 50s, she and her husband, they worked together, won a competition, they were only in their early 20s, to design a school in Hunstanton in Norfolk. And there they built what is, to me, a marvellous little bit of Mies van der Rohe by the seaside. It's still there. If you're ever in Norfolk, go and see it. It's listed. And she had an extraordinary, controversial architectural career, but she also, at the same time, brought up 3 children who used to have to, basically she kept them under the desk while she was drawing. There's an architect in my, an archaeologist in my book, Jacquetta Hawkes. Jacquetta Hawkes wrote a best-selling book called A Land, and I see her as the kind of mother of all these people like Robert Macfarlane, who are the new nature writers. She sort of did it before them, and she didn't overwrite as they do. She, in post-war Britain, there was a great interest in archaeology. In my book, I speculate that because there were holes in the ground, and this made people think, what is down there? And Jacquetta was part of that interest. She was on the television, she was on the radio talking about archaeology. She also had a very famous love affair. She fell in love with J.B. Priestley over a pink jelly at a UNESCO conference in Mexico. And it was a bolt for both of them. And they had an extraordinary, passionate relationship. They had sex everywhere, including in the box at the theatre. Which, if you know what J.B. Priestley looks like, it's so hard to imagine. But anyway, so she's in my book. There are 2 movie people in my book, Betty Box and Muriel Box, who were sisters-in-law. Every year at Oscar time, we say, where are all the women movie directors? Where are all the women movie producers? But actually, in the 50s, there were lots of women working in movies. They had got their break making the propaganda films at the Ministry of Information and elsewhere. And they just carried on. Muriel was a director, and her sister-in-law, Betty, was a film producer. Betty was really extraordinary. Her nickname was Betty Box Office. She invented the Doctor in the House franchise, which you will all remember. And it was Betty who cast Dirk Bogarde in that film. Previously, he'd always had to play the spivs, and it was Betty who persuaded her bosses at Rank that he could be a heartthrob. She was a fabulous mink coat-wearing character. There's a triangle in my book of women. I think these are the three women of whom I'm fondest. There was Nancy Spain, who was a TV personality, a News of the World columnist, an Express columnist. She wrote some camp detective novels. She was sort of the Stephen Fry of her day. And she fell in love with a woman called Joan Werner-Laurie, who was the editor of She magazine. David just spoke about women's magazines. She magazine was a taboo-busting magazine at a time when women's magazines were basically knitting patterns and, how to keep the house looking nice. She dealt with issues to do with sex and menstruation and all of that. These two fell in love, and they brought up two children together, about whom they told all sorts of lies. They told the little boys they were brothers, but they weren't. Nancy, though, she just couldn't be faithful. She had an affair with Marlene Dietrich, and then she had an affair with a woman called Jeanette Spanier, who was the directrice of Balmain Fashion House. And so at this point, Joan thought, well, I'll take a lover of my own. So she got together with Sheila Van Damme. Sheila Van Damme was a rally car driver. She was the fastest woman in Europe. She once beat Stirling Moss in a time trial. And actually, on the rallying circuit, Stirling Moss used to wash her smalls. I don't suppose he cares to admit that now. And when she tired of being a rally car driver, she got frightened because it was very dangerous. She came back to London and she managed the Windmill Theatre in Soho, which was her father's theatre. The Windmill, famously, was the theatre that never closed in the war and where you were allowed to pose naked so long as you didn't move. And Sheila ran the Windmill as a kind of proto-feminist organisation, which we can maybe talk about that later. And finally, and perhaps most remarkably, there's a lawyer in my book, Rose Heilbronn, and she's the presiding spirit of the book. Rose was the first woman KC, or QC, as she would be now. She was the first woman judge. She was the first woman to defend in a murder trial. She was the first woman to sit at the Old Bailey. She came from a working-class Jewish family in Liverpool. She was extraordinarily intelligent, and she was beloved by the tabloid press. And this is one way in which this country is definitely moving backwards. Women in the newspapers now, it's all how big your thighs are. But Rose there were headlines which said, "Is this our cleverest woman?" Of course, people followed murder trials very closely in those days because hanging was still in, and they had this queasy import someone could drop at the end. And Rose was famous for getting people off. Now, for the purposes of my book, I was very interested in a trial that she was involved with in the early 50s. A woman called Violet Wright, who lived on a houseboat in Ebbsfleet in Essex, was accused of setting fire to her houseboat and deliberately killing her baby twins because she wanted to go to Australia with her boyfriend. Violet had a rackety life. She had lots of men in her life and children by different men, and she lived in this, pretty grim community, in the mud. And Rose was her defence lawyer. Things looked really bad for Violet. It wasn't only the fact that she'd been seen buying things with which you could set a houseboat alight. It was also that her private life was never going to play well with a 1950s jury. And I think that everyone in that courtroom believed that she would definitely be for the noose. On the final day of the trial, Rose stood up, this young woman. She touched her wig, she adjusted her lipstick, and she launched the most extraordinary defence speech. She told the jury that there was no way that Violet could have planned the fire that killed her children, because when the police and the fire brigade arrived, she was wearing her rollers. And the jury bought it. She got a 2-year manslaughter charge, and because of the time she'd already done, she was free to go. Now, to me, this sums up what I wanted to say with my book. the 50s on the one hand was the pull of the past was still there. You were still ashamed to go out in your rollers. But on the other hand, on that day, in that courtroom, the most important, the most charismatic person was a young woman who was there for her wit alone. She was the future. I think I'll just end on that note.
When my dad died in 2006, I found myself looking at my parents as they were at that time and wondering how they had become the people they'd turned into. Because it was a fairly unhappy situation that they'd arrived at. All my dad's sort of charismatic charm had sort of been worn away by many years of drinking and depression. And my mother had turned into a quite internalized, crabby, cantankerous woman, which I'm sure she'd never been for most of her life. And it came to me that we only ever see the second half of our parents' lives, the downhill part. And it's the golden years are the ones we know nothing about, and those are the ones we have to piece together. And when this thought struck me somewhat like a thunderbolt, the first thing I did, which is what everybody does these days, is I actually wrote that line, which is the opening line of the book. I put it on Twitter. And I had more retweets and favourites than I'd had for weeks. And I thought, well, this really is something that people really do react to. And it became the cornerstone and the kickoff point for the book. And what I wanted to do was somehow go back and piece together my parents' lives. And their golden years very much had been, particularly for my dad, in the 50s. And for my mum, her great moment had also been in the 50s, although she made a second career for herself in the 60s and 70s as my dad's career as a jazz musician started to fall apart. My dad was actually born a working-class Glaswegian jazz musician and really wanted to escape from home, and the war gave him the social mobility. He was very precocious as a teenager, believed he ought to be the greatest jazz musician Britain had ever produced, and managed to leapfrog his way into London after the war, where he became a pianist, a jobbing pianist for orchestras like Harry Roy at the Café de Paris. And then in 1956, his great friend Brian Ricks, the actor-manager who went on to have a lot of success in farces at the Whitehall Theatre, was also a secret jazz fan, and paid for my dad to do some jazz orchestra demos, which were so impressive. He got a foot in the door at the BBC and managed to get a band at Quaglino's. And suddenly he was living a very glamorous West End lifestyle, and very much the life that he wanted to lead. But it lasted about 4 or 5 years, and then just as he reached his peak, rock and roll pretty much kicked his career into the long grass. There wasn't any money or appetite for big bands and jazz ensembles. As a comparative, my mother had a very different upbringing. You would probably call it middle class. Her father was a Methodist minister and also quite a well-known radio broadcaster in the 30s and 40s. He broadcast as Romany of the radio, who was a kind of latter-day David Attenborough, David Bellamy kind of figure, one of the first people to do nature broadcasts on the radio. They would stage manage them in studios to make them sound like they were actually out in the field. And Romany would be walking around with these two schoolgirls who were actually two 40-year-old women putting on voices. And they would say things like, "Oh, look, Romany, a little hedgehog popping through the hedge." And he would say, "Yes, that'll be old Hotchkiss," and all this kind of stuff. So, anyway, my mother grew up with this, this mixture of a very sort of puritanical Spartan background from her parents' Methodism, but also attracted by the limelight of acting. And that is what she wanted to do. And when she left, when the war ended for her, she went straight to RADA without telling her parents, and managed to get on a course while still in her uniform. She then married Richard Findlater in 1948, who went on to become leading theatre critic at The Observer and actually discovered John Osborne, who you mentioned earlier on. And her acting ambitions were still very strong. And in 1950, thinking that she was never really going to get any work, she landed a plum role at Stratford-upon-Avon for what was to become the Royal Shakespeare Company, acting as a walk-on in small parts with people like John Gielgud, Alan Bedell, Anthony Quayle was the director, Peter Brook did the production at the time. And I realized when she used to tell me the stories about it that was her golden moment. She once said to me when she was in her 70s that she realized that was the time when she was accepted, which was something she wasn't with my dad towards the end, who was very controlling of her. But just as she had this chance, and it looked like her career as an actress was going to take off, she got pregnant, and she had one child, and then she got pregnant again 18 months later and had 3 more. So 4 children really put paid to all her acting ambitions. And what made matters worse was she realized that the man she'd married, she wasn't sure she loved. So she was caught in this terrible, thwarted bind where both her career choice and perhaps her emotional choices weren't going the way she wanted. And it was at this point she ran into a dashing jazz musician at a party, who was, of course, my dad. And this was the real crux of the book, really, their great meeting. It's the late 50s. And it is how, really, they made their own personal, emotional choices the most important ones. But, of course, there was a huge amount of collateral damage. Wounded partners, children caught up in divorces and stuff. But this is really very much what this book is about. And I thought I wanted to read a little bit as well, rather than just talk, because we're going to be doing some more talking in a moment. And I just thought I'd read 2 or 3 pages from my mother talking about when they first met and what their affair was like. And I'll start with the beginning of the affair. They met illicitly for 4 months, riverside pubs and stolen afternoons, a little hotel, the Paragon, and sometimes bolt holes engineered with the help of friends. But beyond the surface clandestine excitement, it's clear from the beginning that it was a door opening onto a new and profound secret world for her, a world that was carnal, adrenalized and consuming, unlike anything at the age of 33 with 4 children and nearly 9 years into a marriage she'd ever known before. A few letters preserved from the period are unblushingly frank and unposed, as if this time she really had, as her mother used to say, gone off at the deep end. It wasn't long before she was describing it in a letter to my dad as the most overwhelming, beautiful, tender, savage thing that has ever happened to me. Looking back now and bearing in mind the changes and loosening in the divorce laws that have taken place since 1969, it's hard to imagine what entangled years lay in store for couples who met as ardently and dramatically as my parents did in 1957. The rights of the married individual have long since displaced antiquated notions of moral fibre and dangers to the fabric of society. But back then, the divorce laws of the day permitted annulment only on the grounds of adultery or cruelty or desertion lasting at least 3 years. Even when the Royal Commission on Marriage and Divorce of 1956 was set up to review increasing pressures in the post-war years to see marriage merely as a companionate alliance between two people in an increasingly individualized world, as opposed to a legal binding duty that involved the state as well, no changes were made. A relationship that broke down was not enough. It was against this background, on the 2nd of July 1957, 4 months after the affair had begun, that my dad's first wife, June, found out. My dad broke the news to my mum in the tiny Grenadier pub on Wilton Row near Hyde Park Corner. He vowed it would make no difference, and they talked themselves into renting a flat for 6 weeks in Sussex Gardens in Bayswater to continue their secret assignations. Quite how soon afterwards Ken, my mum's first husband, found out is unclear, but the affair was fully exposed by the end of August, and my mum and dad seemed unable to sustain the duplicity. In early September, they were preparing to reconcile with their respective partners. On the final night before the lease ran out on the Bayswater flat, my mum stayed up late alone while my dad was out performing at Quaglino's and wrote an open letter to herself. It begins, written to the strains of Jack Payne on Eve's Lousy Wireless. On this night of September the 4th at 11:30, sitting in this strange girl's flat, in which I have been since Monday, I feel for the sake of the future and the past I must write down a couple of things. Tomorrow I give in the keys. The oddest thing, almost, is that I should be so besotted in this business that we have a flat, us. He and I actually have a flat of our own, and have had for 6 weeks. I am so steeped in now that I can entirely neglect my children, my lovely, lovely triplets, and my awkward, heart-rending, nervy Simon. Can entirely and utterly banish them from my thoughts. That Ken, my dear husband of almost 9 years, is a stranger to me, as strange as a piece of furniture, a thing, not a person anymore. And I realize I'm doing this for what? For my lover, for this boyish, randy, sensitive, needful man. What is it I see in him? I know what he sees in me. But there is a terrific core of gentleness, thoughtfulness, passion, vanity, and need there that I find irresistible. Plus humour, often violently simple, gaiety, and, I suppose, though I hate to admit it now, that it has any bearing on the subject, glamour. I love him because he has a creative life of his own. He is above me and brilliant in his own field. And he loves me, I think, because sexually he finds me stimulating, and I am a whole person, he says, developed, he thinks. But emotionally, I am pretty unstable. He talked to me about music again tonight, the things he's playing in the first program. Sally, you're driving me crazy. They can't take that away from me. Which when he said it the last time on this very bed, with tears choking, it seemed the saddest thing I'd ever heard. They're playing Jenny in Love. Poor little girl. Will she go through all this after the years of apparent stability, security, and happiness? I feel I must be such a worthless person to be so wrapped up in this, so unaware of anything else, so vital, so important, yet unless I can be adult enough to remain his mistress and also a good wife and mother, But I can't believe I am strong enough or without conscience. And yet, I love him absolutely still. And tonight I am happy. But tomorrow I must take up the threads and responsibilities again. And the house fills me with foreboding. Please, may everything work out. And yet, why should he bother when I am so wicked? If it's a portrait of my mum in crisis, crazily in love for perhaps the first time in her life, it's also a portrait of the time, a post-war moral maze where her love for her children, duty to her husband, respect for the institution of marriage and fear of Christian judgment run parallel with unstoppable feelings of awakened passion and free will. Reading it now, I find it difficult not to hear its continuous background soundtrack of late-night London jazz and sentimental show songs, spilling through the radio, running through her head, articulating every surge of feeling, all interlacing with the many versions of the same songs she must have heard performed for her in restaurants and clubs and studios by her own lover. If it weren't my own parents' story, I'd say it reads like the overwrought synopsis of a best-selling 50s potboiler. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Well, we're going to have about 10 minutes, I think, roughly, of discussion amongst the three of us, and then obviously throw things open to the floor. Before I ask a question, I think I just wanted to say I do think they're both terrific books, and beautifully written and textured, and full of sympathetic insights, and together they do really enrich our historical understanding. And you know, we compilers of history are very grateful to you people at the coalface, as it were. Rereading Rachel's book and reading Ben's book in the last few days, I've thought quite often of something that crops up quite often in Anthony Paul's Dance to Music of Time sequence. For those of you who read it, I don't know if you remember, but there's a character, a retired general, in the novels who has a theory, which I think is pretty clearly Anthony Paul's own theory, of what he calls the personal myth. And basically the idea is this, that everybody has their own personal myth, their sort of sense of who they would like to be, or perhaps be how they would like to be perceived by the outside world. And everyone's personal myth is different, is unique, and that the secret of, as it were, happiness, or at least call it mental equilibrium, is to get a rough alignment between, on the one hand, one's personal myth, and on the other hand, as it were, objective reality. And if one can achieve that rough alignment, you're okay. It's basically the Anthony Paul theory, which personally I think has got quite a lot going for it. And I wondered, you know, about your various characters, Rachel's 10, Ben's two main characters. In some cases, I could see what probably their personal myths were. In others, I found it more difficult to tell. I think in the case of Ben's parents, it's reasonably clear that your father's personal myth, as it were, was very focused on the jazz and on the music, and on, you know, as a young man, some conception he had of what he might achieve, and so on. I found it a bit harder to tell with your mother. So I wondered if perhaps you could perhaps elaborate a little bit more on the personal myth idea, and also this: are we talking about personal myths generally, the dominant personal myths being to do with, as it were, the public persona, the work, the external, if you like, or is it more private? And it's interesting, it strikes me with Rachel's characters, they're interesting to us because they're all exceptional people, largely, as it were, in terms of their role or their impact in the broader world. It's, as it were, a pushing outwards from themselves, isn't it? And I wondered if that was, you feel that was their dominant personal myth, as it were, or was it still the private life that mattered, or because they were actually exceptional women at a time when, in the sort of way we're talking about, there were far fewer of them, it had to be the public that was dominant. So I'd be interested in that, if either of you would like to plunge in.
You're already on the high board. I'm just coming up behind you.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I think what struck me about both my parents is that the end of the war was such a crucial moment for them. Yes. I mean, they really used that as a springboard, both personally.
And they're both aged, what, 22, 23?
Early 20s.
So you're just really entering proper.
I mean, what did my mother do?
Life,
she went straight to RADA in her uniform.
Yes.
You know, it was about fulfilling her own personal choices, regardless of what her parents thought.
Yes.
And what did my dad do? He shrugged off his Glasgow accent and went straight to Soho.
Yes. So it's sort of almost, well, not quite unique, but a very unusual moment, when that moment that everyone has of entering adult life and defining themselves happens to coincide with a sort of at least an illusion of a kind of blank canvas in the world, in the broader world at large, on which you can, because the world had to be remade, as it were, after the war, didn't it?
I mean, I think also they were very progressive in the sense that they were very insistent that they shrugged off the perceived shackles of the 40s, if you like.
Yes.
I mean, they were, ambitious.
Yes.
Both of them, for personal.
Did they? I don't think it comes. Does it cut so much? Did they talk about? I mean, obviously they were growing up particularly in the difficult time of the 30s, and then going into the war as adolescents. Did they talk about, as it were, austerity and all that?
Well, of course. I mean, both my parents went through that in different ways. My dad grew up in a very working class Christian socialist household, where his father came home from he was a foreman at the local steelworks, and just would hammer the table with moralizing Christian socialism, all about probity and godliness, and how capitalism was a great avarice.
Yes.
And my dad swallowed this every night. And my mother, at the same time, grew up in a very austere. She moved from manse to manse. These sort of Methodist houses that she grew up in.
Yes.
I think the women in my book are a mixture. I mean, I think that some of them were, for instance, Alison Smithson, the architect, she knew she wanted to be an architect as a teenager. She did an architecture degree. She started work. But more of them are probably pragmatists. They had to be flexible, open to any opportunities. Yes. I mean, Muriel Box, who was the film director, her first job was as a secretary in a corset factory. Yes. And it was a case of you just looked for any little chink that you could get into. She didn't really know anything about the movies at all, but she got a job as a secretary in a film company next. Yes. And one day the continuity girl was away, and she stepped in. She didn't know how to use the clapperboard, but she just pretended. And so she moved. She moved up. So so the kind of myth making element of those women came later, because it was only really once they'd got to a certain point and they thought, this is what I want to do. And that may have taken them a while. But I definitely think, without exception, the war, definitely. And I think people underestimate how frightening it was when the war ended if you were a woman. One of the people that I interviewed for the introduction of the book was a fantastic photographer called Grace Robertson, who worked at the Picture Post. And she told me a wonderful story about how she was standing waiting for a bus outside Harrods, and the New Look had come in, and the New Look were these enormous skirts. And of course no one had any fabric, but they used their blackout curtains to make the skirts. And the bus pulled up, and the woman ahead of her in the queue struggled to get on the bus because of her skirt. And Grace said to me, I mean, Grace is a very old woman now, but Grace said, I remember thinking, this is part of the plot. They want us to wear these skirts, so we all stop working. And, that in Parliament, Bessie Braddock, the Labour MP, stood up and said, the New Look is a disgrace, it's anti-women.
No nonsense.
Yeah. So I think that the women in my book, they genuinely felt that the war had been, although painful, exciting too. And they had this intense sense of claustrophobia that they were determined to resist, you know. And that helped them and gave them courage, which is what you need.
Yes, yes.
I mean, it's also interesting, with my mother, when she came out of RADA, she got a few acting jobs in Rep and was spotted by Richard Findlater, who, that was his pen name, his real name was Ken. And when they first married, she basically set up the home, but realised that this wasn't enough for her, and she got involved with BBC writing essays. There was a whole slew of women's programmes immediately after the war, you know, following the kitchen front and the women in wartime came things like housewife choice and my mother wrote essays about the right to work and bring up children at the same time, and told the story about how she was adamant that she would carry on acting and how she went to Stratford to act. So it was very much in her mind that the two could be done at the same time.
So both your parents, in a way, had sort of radical instincts, but kind of slightly clashing radical instincts. Is that fair to say? Or not?
I think clashing is the operative word with my parents. I'll stop, really, actually.
Yeah. One thing that your books...
In a loving way, but they were very much, you know...
sort of a version of They Clash by Night. One thing that really your books did make one think about was sort of the shape of someone's life, really. And I mean, it's really that haunting opening line, the line that got retweeted. Certainly when I was little, I used to imagine people's lives went in a sort of continuous kind of upward kind of curve or graph until finally you got to the top and then you'd done your time and you departed, as it were. And obviously that's actually not, in most cases, not how it is. And there's a lot of, particularly on your father's part, you know, a lot of either explicit or implicit bitterness about how things panned out, because, you know, largely because, in a way, you know, forces beyond his control, cultural forces beyond his control. But Rachel, I wondered about some of your subjects. The afterlives, as it were. For example, in the case of the boxes, chronologically speaking, there's a long afterlife, isn't there? You record quite reasonably, sort of matter-of-factly, that when they died, and this is 20 or 30 years after your main narrative comes to an end, or the extraordinary afterlife of Patience Gray, which perhaps might just say something briefly about, because it is absolutely extraordinary. But generally, how your subjects coped with a second half or last third or whatever of a life that was, as it were, on a downward slope.
And I think there's this works on two levels, really, because on the level of my book, you know, I had to write this book because these women had been forgotten, and that tells you something about the way history is written, and it also tells you something about the way their lives worked out, that in spite of the work they did, you know, they could be somehow, they felt or they were perceived as having been failures. So, I mean, a lot of them, their careers just petered out in a way that their male equivalents' careers probably didn't peter out. And I think that probably still happens now. But a lot of them were able to have these wonderful sort of codas because they become so brave and, to be honest, difficult.
Alison Smith.
And you know, some of them were difficult, and so that enabled them that when things did kind of peter out, they could maybe do something else. So when Muriel Box's directing career ended. I mean, she didn't give up the movies gave up her, but then she started a feminist publishing house. Patience Gray, Patience's life in London just was kind of a disaster in all different ways, but she fell in love with this sculptor, and he worked in marble, and so they went to Europe to find marble for him, and they pitched up in this masseria in Puglia, which is like a big house with no water and no heating and no nothing. And they lived like, you know, Italian peasants. And out of that, she wrote a book called Honey from a Weed, which is about, you know, living on weeds. And it is, I mean, you know, classic is an overused word. It's a classic cookbook. I mean, it's in print now, and it's all of our kind of foraging, trendy, you know, here's some samphire. All of that comes from Patience Gray. So she she was able to kind of have another go as an older woman. I mean, she was very old indeed when she did that.
We must move to just open it up just a moment, perhaps last thing, but the subject that actually particularly got under my skin of yours, Rachel, was Jacketta Hawkes.
Yes.
Because there is some sense in which, she'd written this wonderful book, and then along, have I got the chronology right, more or less then along comes, or just before, comes
Yes, that's right.
J.B. Priestley, this kind of sex god, and pipe-smoking sex god, and something gets lost, doesn't
Yes.
it?
I mean, that's the other thing, and I think Ben's book illustrates this as well, is whether your husband is going to help you or hinder you. Some of the women in my book worked in partnership with their husbands. It was their husbands who gave them a chance. Muriel only directed movies because her husband, Sidney, who was a producer, lied to the studios and said, don't worry, I'm directing the picture. And then on the first day of shooting, Muriel would take over. But in the case of Jacketta, I think that J.B. Priestley just wiped out her career. I think she would have done great work.
And then she has that, very last thing, but she writes this extraordinary novel, published 4 years before Priestley's death, a little bit more before her own. I've forgotten what it was called.
It's called A Quest of Love, which just tells you about it, really.
It's a fantastically angry, bitter book, isn't it?
It's a novel, but it's really thinly disguised autobiography, and it's all about her. It's an old woman's frustration, and she describes a lot of her sexual encounters. But beyond that, you feel. I think Priestley just came and took over.
Yes.
And she wasn't really permitted to work in the same way.
No. Well, he was a Bradfordian of his age.
Yes.
Ironically, my mother's first husband, the man she rejected, was a facilitator.
Was an encourager, yes.
Because when she began her second career as a journalist, he was the one who started her off with the right contacts and got her first articles.
Yes.
But of course, my dad, her second husband,
you see,
he was more of a resistor because I think he was thwarted in his own life. And to be quite honest, I don't think he put much stock by my mum's writing.
No, but I mean, if he was, from a Glaswegian of his background, those would be very, the probability is those would be very entrenched attitudes or assumptions, wouldn't they?
Yes, but he made such a play of shrugging off his background.
Yes, no, sure, but
of losing his accent, of being classless was his great.
But
great
you
phrase,
usually can't take, the thing out of the person and so on, I guess.
Yeah, but
we should open up actually.
Yeah.
We've got 10 minutes. So would anyone like to fire away, gentleman there? Do we have mics? Great.
Thank you. Is it coming through? Okay. No.
Oh.
Yeah, we could hear it.
Oh, we can hear it. Okay. My apologies. I think firstly and very briefly. A thank you to Ben, because actually your and Tracy's music was many years ago the soundtrack to our romance, so thank you for that. My question really is about gendered relationships and to both Rachel and to Ben in writing your books, how that might have changed or maybe highlighted your perceptions of contemporary gendered relationships.
Well, I think things are quite difficult for women now, young women particularly, and the thing that's in the background of my book's about the 1950s, but I want it to be read by young women now because I wanted to write something encouraging and inspiring. I wanted to say it was really hard then, and look what these 10 women did. In terms of my own, my friends and me, I think about these things a lot, and I'm like Ben. I'm from quite a complicated family with lots of marriages, and I had a father who crushed my mother's ambition, and I'm really lucky that I'm married to someone who is really encouraging and not envious of my career, and I don't take that. I think that's the greatest thing you can have, really. It's so important.
Just waiting for it to land on us.
It's a drone.
Yeah.
It's a drone.
I don't really know. I mean, I think I live obviously quite a rarefied life in that I don't, I've grown up making a living out of self-expression all my life. So has Tracy. I think we obviously have led a very charmed and lucky life, being having the success we've had doing what we do. But I look at my kids now, and how they're going to grow up and make their own relationships and stuff. And I don't know. Life seems very complicated. My kids, they're incredibly thoughtful already and worried about, social mobility. Is university any good for you? What do I do at the end of all these GCSEs? Are they going to be of any use to me? How am I going to meet anybody? We're all just trapped in front of screens. My kids are aware of this, and they're the ones who are actually, it's very easy to judge them, but they know what's going on, and they are concerned.
One thing I just wanted to say on that is that one thing that I really sort of envied about the subjects in my book, in spite of all the things that were against them, they did have one thing that we have they didn't have, which is guilt. These women lived in a pre-guilt age. This whole thing about juggling and, that just didn't exist. If you picked up a magazine, it told you how to knit a sweater. It didn't tell you that you were rubbish at running your life. And nowadays, women are just told, you are a failure. Whatever you do, you didn't get married, failure. You had a career, you're an old bag. You had children, were you there when they got home from school? The women in my book, they didn't have to deal with any of that. Mm-hmm. Now, and that released them. And, of course, their children sometimes had a difficult time. I'm not denying that. That would be wrong. But they didn't carry this kind of extra invisible burden.
I think it was just on the cusp of changing at the beginning of the 60s. So, at the beginning of the 60s,
Sorry? Yes, I don't mean... Yeah, but not about, you weren't told all the time, you can't do this, you can't do this. It wasn't the same. Well, here we go.
I kind of think...
What I mean is that the media culture was completely different. You didn't have Grazia magazine telling you that you were fat. It's just a different media culture. Well, I'm sorry about your mum. I'm sorry about that.
Right at the back, and then perhaps you after someone at the back.
Yes, I'd like to talk about the problem of the socially conservative aspect of the time, because this is about Rachel's book. I thought it was very well written, and you bring out, and I haven't read all of it, but I read the article about Nancy Spain. She was the one person, I was a teenager in the 50s, she was the one person I'd heard of, because she was a real personality. But the amazing thing was, she was caught up in that, because obviously she had a child out of wedlock. Yeah. I mean, she also had gay relationships, which were obviously taboo, but she had a child out of wedlock. And then she allowed it, the child didn't know that she was the mother. I think it's so poignant. And then, when she and her partner are killed, and you do just mention this, the two boys that were then at boarding school, I mean, they were told that, but of course they thought they were brothers. They were told that their mother and their so-called aunt were dead, but they were treated really badly. One of them didn't even go to the funeral. So I think there was a casualness and a misunderstanding and a non-understanding about children. And the other thing I just wanted to bring up was Patience Gray. I mean, her life at the beginning, when she had 2 children with a married man, I'm not condemning that, but she managed because she had a very good mother who
No, she hated her mother. You've misread that.
But her mother looked after the children and didn't judge. Then she gets pregnant again and decides she can't manage with 3 children without a husband. And so that that baby is up for adoption. The baby is ill, and she is asked to breastfeed the baby. She has the baby back to look after it. Unfortunately, the baby dies. And then she doesn't even go to the funeral, and she's not allowed to go to the funeral.
I know, but what's your point? Because I
my
wrote the
point
book,
is,
so I know this.
I know, I'm telling other people. The point is, there was still that awful treatment of children, and if you were not, if you weren't conventional, there was still no understanding, I think, of bereavement and that sort of thing.
Well, they're two very different. Those two cases are very different. Patience's children, obviously I spoke to all the children. Patience's children feel that they weren't damaged by the way she brought them up, and they are quite wry about the fact that she told them to hitchhike all the way home from Italy when they were, 12 and things like that. Nancy is a different case. I didn't feel that my role is to judge these women for the way that they brought up their children. I think they were doing the best they could in very difficult circumstances. But in Nancy's particular case, she was a lesbian. She wasn't bisexual, she was a lesbian. And she was a lesbian at a time when you couldn't be lesbian. So when she got pregnant, they made a decision to bring the boys up as brothers. And my belief is that was, once that decision had been taken, I think Nancy almost, there came a point in Nancy's life where if you had said, but you had that baby, she would have almost forgotten it, because she had to be, in order that she got no trouble from the press, she had to be ruthless about what she was presenting to the world. And it is an extraordinary story, and it's a painful story. Those boys I know too, and it's painful. It was painful, but people do what they have to do. I'm certainly not. I didn't feel it was my role to say, well, you were a bad mother.
No, I wasn't suggesting it. I was saying that the way those boys were treated after they died, that they weren't allowed to, one of them didn't go to the funeral.
Yeah, well, that went on for years. I didn't go to funerals when I was small.
And think about the film The Queen. There
Yeah.
wasn't huge
Yeah.
sort of emotional intelligence
Yeah.
there, was there, that
Yeah.
Sunday morning? I think we might be near time, but would you like to?
Well, the people that you're talking about who lived in the 50s are very florid kind of people. They're unusual. I was brought up in the 50s, like a lot of people here, and it was marvellous. With the 44 Education Act, it meant that all my friends went to a grammar school, and we had a wonderful time. And I think we're often misrepresented. For us, it was great, and I just wondered what you thought about that, because you've obviously written marvellous books about particular people, but there were ranks of us who fought our fathers and managed to get to university in spite of everything, and we've gone on to do a lot of things, and all my contemporaries worked after they were married. So that's the story that many people here would know. So I'd love to hear what you thought about that rather than about
Well, I
the
think
people.
both my parents fought their parents as well in different ways. My father reacted very much against his background, and my mother reacted against hers. They used those as springboards. You had the opportunity of grammar school education and university for the first time. My parents had the opportunity to go into the things they loved, which happened to be into the arts. But I don't think, I think it was exactly the same process. It's just they went into different walks of life.
Yeah. Just to wrap up, I'd just
This
like to
lady's desperate.
say one thing, which is it was.
Talk to us afterwards.
Opportunities were increasing, but not for everyone. And we must always remember, it seems to me, and it's a debate that will run and run, but for every child who went to a grammar school, 3 went to secondary moderns. I went to university in the early 70s. even after the great Robbins expansion, only 10% of my peer group were going to university. 10%, 1 in 10, 9 out of 10 weren't. We're very fortunate, but we're very fortunate, but slightly unusual.
I think that it looks to me like this one could run and run.
It could.
And
It could.
as ever, and as so often, the real stars can be the audience. So, audience, thank you very much for your contributions, and please continue them. But also a huge thanks to the insights we've had on the platform this afternoon, a really fascinating and obviously incredibly thought-provoking and debate-worthy presentation from all three of you. To be continued out in the tent. If you'll just stay in your seats for a couple of moments, and I'll take David and Rachel and Ben out to the book tent, and I'm sure they